Hello, this is Dr. Locke. In this video, I'm going to walk you through the steps required to complete this Pivot Tables and Charts ExPrep assignment. So go ahead and follow the link in your Canvas course to download the file that you need for that. And once you have that open, you can join me. So here's my file. In this one, there are lots of tabs. And if you notice, there's an overview tab followed by another tab that has the same name, just missing the word overview. So the overview tab has some description of what that function is about, and then you actually practice it in the next tab. So we're just going to walk our way through these tabs from left to right. So the first one is just to insert the pivot table and how we do that. So the instructions are in the gray box here. The first step is to create a pivot table, analyzing this table below. And we're given a data range, C7 through H32. And then we're going to place the pivot table in this same worksheet. All right, so we'll go to Insert, Pivot Table. Click that pivot table button and you'll get this dialog box, and you want to make sure that the table or range of data is selected here, and so we want to select the range C7 to H32. So I'm going to click on C7 and drag down to H32 to select that. And so Excel fills in the syntax for me that it's in the Insert Pivot Table sheet, cell range C7 through H32. I don't want it to go in a new worksheet. I want it to go in this worksheet, and I can choose where. It just says in the same worksheet. So I'm going to click K13. I've just picked a cell in the same worksheet, and then I'll click OK. All right, and there's my blank pivot table, and that's it for this step. It's just to insert the pivot table. All right, the next step, modify field selection. So this is going to enable us to add data to our pivot table and make some modifications to it. Let's move on to the next tab. All right, so here is our blank pivot table. Just like what we created previously, and that pivot table is connected to this data range, and here are the names, the headers of those columns in that data range. So we can choose those to build our pivot table with. So let's see, we're going to use the pivot table field list that we see here and find the total invoice amount for each salesperson. All right, so if this is not showing for you, you can go to the Pivot Table Analyze tab. If you click in this pivot table, you'll get this Pivot Table Analyze tab. And then the field list, there's a button here for that. You can turn it off and on. So turn that on if you don't have it automatically. All right, so what we want to do is find the total invoice amount for each salesperson. The salesperson field can be placed in the rows area. So I'm going to grab the salesperson. I'll click on it and put it in the rows area of this pivot table. There are my salespeople. And I want the invoice amount for each person. So that is my value. I want the value of that for each salesperson. And by default, it's finding the sum of invoice amount, and I want the total, so sum is what makes sense here. I can make changes to that by going to value field settings if I need to. All right, so that's it for that step. Now let's move on to calculated field. We can create calculated fields to add to what is available to us in a pivot table. So we'll do that in this next step. So click on the Calculated Field tab, and I'll click in that pivot table to see what's been selected. It's basically what we did in the last step. Now we're going to create a calculated field to find the bonus for each salesperson. Their bonus is calculated by taking 5% of their total invoice amount, and we need to name it bonus. So when you've clicked on this pivot table, to get these tabs above, if you click on Pivot Table Analyze, there's a calculations group here. And if you click on this one named Fields, Items, and Sets, you'll see Calculated Field. So click on that, and you get this Insert Calculated Field dialog box. We want to name this field Bonus, and then we can provide a formula for it. The bonus is going to be 5%, so I can put 0.05 of the invoice amount. So I'm going to double click on invoice amount and click OK. All right, and there is the bonus amount. All right, and that's it for that step. We can move on to the next one, slicers. We can use a slicer for filtering a pivot table or pivot chart. So I'm going to go to Slicers, that tab. And for this pivot table now, we want to compare invoice amounts by region. So we're going to create a filter for this pivot table that will enable us to do that. Notice that the data that this pivot table is connected to has region as one of the fields. So we can include a slicer based on any of these fields. We're going to base our slicer on region. So back in Pivot Table Analyze, I can choose in the filter group, I can choose Insert Slicer. And I want to base this slicer on region, so I can click OK after I've checked that. And there's my region slicer. All right, and we're not told to select any particular region, so I'm going to clear the selection. But notice that we could choose a particular region to filter by if we wanted to. But I'm going to clear the selection so that all regions are included in what's showing there. All right, and that's it for our slicer. Now let's use the getPivotData function. That's a function that is used to extract information from a pivot table. So what I'm going to do is in cell 09, following the instructions, I'm going to click in there because that's where I want this formula to end up, but I want to display the invoice amount grand total. So if I just click in the pivot table, then Excel will fill in that formula for me. So I'm going to click on the sum of invoice amount grand total. First need to type equals and then click on this cell that contains that total. And notice that it fills in the getPivotData function with the result that I want to show there. All right, so that is extracting this particular data point from the pivot table and just displaying it in cell 09. All right, moving on to the pivot chart. A pivot chart is simply an Excel chart that is based on the data that is in a pivot table. And so we're going to make one of those. Here we have a pivot table, and notice those hashtags. I'm going to auto-fit these columns. So those hashtags don't mean errors. They simply mean that you need to make your columns wider so you can see the values. They just weren't displaying fully. So we're going to add a pivot chart to this pivot table, and we're going to use a 3D stacked column chart using the pivot table data. So if we go into Pivot Table Analyze, there you'll see in the Tools group, there's a Pivot Chart button. So if I click Pivot Chart, then there are some different, I can choose from lots of different types of charts. I'm going to make a 3D stacked column chart. So here is a clustered column. The next is a stacked column. And here's my 3D stacked column. So I'll select that and click OK. And there's my chart. And I could make changes to that, move it around if I need to, but I've completed the task that I'm given in that step. All right, so with that, you are done with this assignment and ready to submit it to ExPrep for grading. If you have any trouble with it, be sure and reach out to your instructor for help.